understanding that it's going to take some time. And it's really, I think in many ways, the grieving person and the traumatized person is helping them, encouraging them to be very comfortable with questions and not answers. One of the things, there's a writer named Tom Attic who talks about that really, anytime anybody goes through loss, that a person needs to relearn the world, right? They need to relearn themselves, who they are as a person. They need to relearn their relationship to time, to space, to spirit. In all truth, particularly for adults, learning as an adult is not easy, right?
And in Claire's case, she's not only dealing with her grief and her loss, but she's also dealing with what I would say is incredible anger against the perpetrator. And she says a number of things that a lot of people find incredibly violent against this perpetrator that committed this atrocity.
Yeah.
Talk to us about that and how also that's part of the process of healing and dealing and addressing those issues.
Well, anger as a sign of grief is really, it's almost biologically driven. You start with a baby, right? A young baby is feeding at the breast, and the mother pulls the breast away sooner than the baby wants. The baby is going to try to bite, right? That sense of anger and kind of aggression is inborn into us. With Claire, I think what that anger is about is her sense of justice has been violated, and it enrages her. Everything she's based her life on, that there's a caring God, that there's a just God, right? And so that anger needs to be acknowledged. I certainly am a believer that anger in and of itself is a justified response, but very often anger is the other side of sadness. And an anger is someone who's enraged. It's a good way to kind of stay away from the sadness, right? And then part of the grieving process and the therapeutic process is to kind of find their way to the other side of that coin.
Well, thank you so much. I want to open it for some of your questions if you have any questions for Ben. Are there any questions? Yes, sir.
Just what was the name of the writer, Tom Attic? Or
Thomas Attig, Attig.
Thank you.
Yes, in the back.
You didn't mention guilt. Isn't she suffering so much more than she survives? And when people are being traumatic events like that, if they live and other people don't, they're guilt involved in this?
The lady's talking about guilt, survivor's guilt, as some people call it.
Absolutely. There's a whole range of feelings, but guilt is certainly many traumatized people, right? Why am I here? What was it about me that allowed me to be here? And guilt is a tough and a prevalent feeling. I was working with a woman whose son died, committed suicide about a month ago, and her grief style is she's not a big crier. She's actually, and she's able to function a month in. She's going to work and feels tremendous sense of guilt and disloyalty that she's able to smile, right? That on some level we come to associate suffering and love. And this woman is suffering, but many people feel guilt at continuing, right, in the face of tragedy. And that's certainly, I guess what's important to highlight, in my estimation, is that there's a whole, we could go through 10 or 15 key feelings that are associated with the grief experience, and not everybody's going to go have each one. Right? There are going to be, some people might, but it's not necessary. And I always say to people, you're part of the club even though you don't meet all these quote requirements.
Yeah, I was also gonna, yes, I was gonna ask you about that because in this play, Claire is suicidal, and we see that moment when she's, being pulled from the ledge. And certainly not everybody that experiences trauma or this level of grief is suicidal or is depressed, right? Do we call this post-traumatic stress disorder a form of depression? Is complicated grief a form of depression, or is it very different than depression?
Well, there's some difference. Depression is part of complicated grief, right? But it's, it's interesting. Pure depression and sort of pure grief, when someone who's really purely depressed, kind of their overall experience with it is, I'm no good. Someone who's really grieving, it's the world's no good. Somebody's missing from the world. But someone who's in complicated grief, there are elements of depression, and teasing them out is it's not always easy. It's not always direct, but certainly depression, feeling like all the kind of the vegetative symptoms of depression in terms of hopelessness and eating problems and sleep problems.
Spilling your tea, perhaps.
Right.
Any other questions that you might have for Ben? Yes, right here in the middle.
How often do your patients, if at all, speak about this thing that came up in the play of feeling like out of it, out of body, that something is silly, or maybe feeling out of the situation?
Sometimes people who are traumatized, I don't know if I would call that dissociation. You mean sort of being, that's one way, that's one reaction that some people who are traumatized react to depression because the question is why can't they be in their body? It's too painful, right? There's something too painful about the experience, so we need to leave. And the process of therapy is about re-inhabiting the body, re-inhabiting their experience, finding a way to reinterpret it, finding a way to integrate it. So there's some, I wouldn't say that, my practice is not exclusively with traumatized people, but certainly, work with many women seriously sexually abused who have, experienced both in their lives and in session with me moments of dissociation.
Yes, in the back.
I was confused by her reaction when she said that immediately when he put the gun up that she had sex with him. And I was just wondering if, and the aside of the bonobos, and I was just wondering if psychologically she kind of mixed those feelings of like a desire and a hate, or like what was going through her mind. Was that even happening? Just curious about that.
We're just going to respond to some of the sort of elements in the play, and then we're going to let Ben talk a little bit more from a sort of psychological perspective. But in terms of the structure of the play, certainly is, the play is composed of different moments and vignettes and sort of explorations, right? So some of them are things that are happening, others are in her head, moments of imagination. And that's the interest of the playwright, to make us ask those questions. Where is this coming from? Where are we? So some of it might be in her head, right? It's not that she had sex with the perpetrator, right?
No, I don't feel like I have any, quote, professional take on that. I'd be interested in your take. How I related to it, kind of my association to it is that sometimes when you're so down, when you're so broken, there's a desire to feel alive, right? To kind of feel something, to really feel something passionate and alive, and that was, I sort of saw that moment as an attempt to kind of get back into life and feel
Control,
something-
perhaps? of-
Yeah, to feel something deeply. What do you think? What was your take?
Well, I guess I thought that, I thought more of the control aspect, because of also the way that they, framed it, with the tribes of bonobos and how kind of when they interact, that's a form of, you know, like instead of tension, that's their way of kind of asserting themselves.
Mhm.
And so, you know, I saw that as a corollary.
And I saw it as her way of imagining how she might have neutralized the
The
situation.
situation, potentially.
Diffused it.
Yeah.
Again, back to the survivor guilt, what could I have done? Is there anything I could have done? Back to the bonobo.
Well, not only what could I have done in the play, she makes us feel that that's what she did, right? So she, you know, but of course it's in her mind. Yeah. Any other questions? Any other thoughts? Anything else that we haven't asked you that you would want to share with us about your impressions of the play or grief and trauma?
Well, I guess just relating to that last piece that you just mentioned, I mean, I think one of the really painful parts of that many grieving people and traumatized people live with is that cavalcade of what if questions. What if? Right? It's kind of counterfactual somehow. Maybe if this would have happened, if that would have happened, and if I would have, you know, if I would have not gone to the store that night, if I would have canceled choir practice that night, it's a torture, really. It's really an attempt to regain control, right? To sort of, when I talked about that assumption that we basically assume that we can control our lives. We like to believe that in fact it's healthy, right? We only cross them when it's green light. We're going to be okay. We're going to be safe. But that's a very torturous process, trying to undo what happened. That's really, and part of what ultimately a grieving person needs to come to grips with. This is real. My life has changed. My life is different. It's never going to be the same. But in spite of that, I'm going to have to find some way to reinvest, even in a broken world. To be able to say, I guess ultimately, we're all in here, and sort of the we're all in here. I mean, we're all broken, we're all imperfect, we're all hurting, everyone's not a survivor of trauma, but we're all survivors of loss. And so we're here, and so that's really the best thing there is, right? That's what we've got. We're here together.
And in a sense, the choir community could be a therapeutic community. When people sing, when people come together to sing, that could be a therapeutic experience. Just like you would, for some individuals, attending group therapy, it's a way to heal and to get connected and feel like they're not alone and begin to reconnect with their world, would you say?
Absolutely.
Well, and then another part is healing through the power of an art.
The art
So
form,
the
yeah.
art form being the choir, the singing, the enjoyment of beautiful music, and the art form being the theater piece itself.
Indeed. Yes, one last question. Yes, thank you.
In your therapy, do you encounter people who don't want to let go of their grief because they don't want to let go of the people or the worlds they've lost?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's sort of a little, that they want to, again, ultimately, people, that person who doesn't want to let go, who doesn't, is that they suffer under this illusion that they're going to stay connected to their loved one via pain. They don't really fully believe or trust that they can have a relationship with the memory of their loved one while not being in pain. Doesn't mean necessarily the total eradication of pain. That's probably a myth too, that all pain is going to dissipate. But those people, the therapeutic task is really to kind of find a way to love in absence, not only to suffer in absence.
One of the moments in the play, it's a meditation on forgiveness, and there's a moment by the end of the play where she says, I convinced everybody that I forgave him. Is forgiveness an element, or finding forgiveness an element that people try to explore in their therapy around these issues? Is it a goal of counselors in this regard, or is not necessary for this type of treatment or healing around trauma?
I think it's part of it. I would say forgiveness is part of the human dilemma that we're all
Right.
involved in, whether in therapy or not. It's finding a way. All of us have been hurt, and all of us have hurt other people, and on some level, to find a way to make peace with our own imperfections. And vengeance there's a price you pay when you live a life when your mind is dominated by vengeance. And